It's so lovely to see so many of you on this Saturday lunchtime. Thank you to those joining us online as well. We have a cracking talk ahead, and while our speakers replenish their drinks, let me do some housekeeping beforehand. For those in the audience, if you haven't been to a previous talk, we're just letting you know there's fire exits both to each side, just in case. To our online audience, there's a possibility for you to put Q&As. Questions will come at the end, so please use the box at the bottom. And for our audience here, there will be book signing with Luke afterwards, so if you want to have your book signed, have a quick chat, do have that as well afterwards. So I'll quickly do the introductions for both our speakers. First, we have Dr Mai Musié. She is an ancient historian, a public engagement professional, and the recipient of the 2019 Classical Association Prize. She's also the trustee of Classics for All, the Roman Society, and Actors for Dionysus. May's research explores race and ethnicity in the ancient world, and she investigates how the other is represented in ancient Greek and Roman literary sources. She's also passionate about exploring the interconnectivity between the ancient Mediterranean world and Northeast Africa. And of course, we have Luke Pepera. Luke is a writer, broadcaster, historian, and anthropologist dedicated to sharing his passion for African cultures. He was born in Ghana and has a degree from St. Peter's College, Oxford, where he read archaeology and anthropology and studied ancient and medieval African history. Since graduating, Luke has worked at the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Times, and Tatsler, and he's written and presented Africa Written Out of History, as well as a documentary for Dan Snow's History Hits. Luke is here today to talk about his much acclaimed debut book, Motherland, a journey through 500,000 years of African culture and identity. That's a great plug there. Thank you for that, May.
He's doing the chair's job well. That's
exactly.
The interview's job well.
Could you give a warm applause for both our speakers?
Well, it's certainly an absolute great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation. Certainly, HistFest has been doing absolutely amazing work in trying to tell different kinds of stories, and that's what we're here today with Luke, who's going to be telling you a little bit about his book, which is absolutely fascinating. I certainly found it incredibly enlightening, particularly from the perspective of a historian who you think the book is going to be written in a kind of traditional linear way, but surprisingly, it's very different to that. So,
Yes.
so we can talk a little bit about that in terms of the kind of structure, the way that you've structured your book, but to just kind of gently ease you in, perhaps, we can talk about the kind of motivation behind this amazing, incredible book.
Thank you, May, and it's great to be here. So thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Shafi, for those very kind introductions. The reason I was drawn to writing about African history, this broad sweep of African history, is that throughout my life between Ghana and the UK, being exposed to history of all kinds and also to African history, I was always struck by the fact that when it came to Africa in particular, this incredibly diverse, sophisticated place with deep history. Most of the history that is told and that is taught primarily in Europe and in the UK, when it comes to Africans and their history concerns the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, the last 300 years of history pertaining to Africa. And these are incredibly important subjects. You know, I for one moment don't think that we shouldn't study them, or that they've been studied too much per se. But I was always conscious of the fact, especially having been born in and grown up in Ghana, and always going back, that sort of having friends from other places in Africa and talking to them about their cultures and their cultures' histories. There's just so much history that we don't know about, with the continent we don't talk about, that we don't explore, but that still exists, you know, in when you go to Ghana, you know, for the most part, yes, there is some of the history concerning the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. And in fact, I tell a story in the book right at the beginning where I was particularly drawn to ancient and medieval African history because when I was 16 doing an extended project for school, I wanted to do it on the history of one of the ethnic groups I belong to, the Kwehu. So I go to, and as I was trying to understand where I should start my research, one of the places I thought to go was the National Museum in Ghana, and a lot of the artifacts there were to do with the transatlantic slave trade and colonial era. And that's now changed. Thankfully, there's a lot of stuff pertaining to chiefs' regalia and music and storytelling and mythology. And that's you get a flavor of that being in Ghana and being in Africa generally, that there is so much more beneath the surface. But it's just not something that I think on an intellectual level, on a storytelling level, on an academic level, for the most part, and especially when it comes to popular history and popular history books and documentaries, and then also in fiction as well, and scripted stuff, novels, films, TV series, that this history is explored. So that's where I decided to put my attention. I said there are so many people doing slave trade and colonialism, so many people doing it well. So I said, but there is this whole other aspect, and you know, it's with the best and most up-to-date archaeological, genealogical, linguistic, ethnographic evidence, we know almost with 100% certainty that human beings, our entire species in the world, originated in Africa, and that you can even point to the region specifically in Africa, probably in Ethiopia or Kenya, where it is from, which is the origin of humanity. So the African past, African people, African history stretches back hundreds of thousands, if not a million years, and yet there is so much focus and so much attention paid to only the last 300 years. So it's about trying to fill in that gap and just trying to explore some of what's happening beforehand to redress the balance.
And this fits quite nicely with quite a lot of historians at the moment are sort of putting their material out there in trying to recenter Africa, but not just Africa, but it's other parts of the world. So I was struck when I was talking to Peter Frankopan about the motivation behind the Silk Roads book, which you should definitely get. You know, he was growing up and thinking, and he's from a Croatian background, and he was absolutely dismayed of not being able to know more than just beyond kind of British and European history. And it was just that kind of like little spotlights, and then trying to think, well, how does this connect to global history? And that was one of the motivations behind the Silk Roads and kind of recentering India and, you know, the Middle East and China and, you know, kind of the ancient and modern, what makes up our modern world. And I was also struck by, you know, Zainab Badawi's sort of African history book, where she really wanted African scholars to tell their stories and their histories. And I feel extremely passionate about that for so long, when we do get things about Africa, it's usually primarily told within, say, you know, from a Western white perspective, rather than actually, you know, talking to the people who heritage and culture they belong to. So it's kind of so important for us to be there at that sort of the knowledge, kind of not gatekeeping, but certainly in trying to empower people and saying they are, you know, Black and Indigenous scholars who can tell these stories too and do it very well.
Yes, and I think that's one of the benefits. You know, I think it's also something potentially America could be good at, but I don't think they do it as well as that. But in the UK, is that you, because of that colonial past, actually you have the opportunity. You know, there are people here with all these different backgrounds, you know, from India, different parts of Africa, from China, wherever, who've come to call this place home, and they're interested in the history of this place, but they're also interested in the history of their traditional heritage as well. But then I think that means that here you not only get, but then you also have maybe indigenous people here, English people here who'll be doing their own history, which is why even just at this event, you can have Nicola before, literally this morning, talking about young Elizabeth, an important English queen, and then the next event it's Africa as well. So it's opening up, so you get both perspectives, and I think this is somewhere where, especially when it comes to popular history more generally, I think that's where we've been really fortunate that there are people, possibly, usually educated here, but who have an interest in telling these global stories as well. And, as the world, globalization, actually, I wouldn't argue is a new thing per se, but we are, in the last, one could say 500, one could say 50 years, when sort of the West was put at or seen as the center of everything. Now that's changing. It's beginning to change quite rapidly. China and Russia and India and Africa as well, and South America, places like Brazil, who are having undue impact, undue influence. I was struck even when I learned that, for example, with the conflict that's happening between Russia and Ukraine, it was actually South Africa who was early on trying to broker this deal. So it's an African country getting involved between this conflict and two, partly European considered territories. And that's something that I don't think you would have seen 50 years ago. It would have actually been European countries trying to seek peace on the African continent. So I think there's this strange kind of, or not strange, but there's a change happening in the air. And I think it's a big benefit to be able to learn about not only the history of your place, but the history that's happening outside. And I think that's where the popular history that people like Peter are writing, or that Zainab's writing, or that I'm writing, or that even you yourself are writing, will be writing soon, May, is it's important to learn about, as well as the history of these Isles as well, the British Isles. And I think but I think it's something that's happening particularly in the popular realm. I think in terms of schooling, I think maybe that's where we need to catch up. I think even when you mentioned Peter Frankerman, he talks about when he started at school, it being one of the reasons that he wants to write about is that the education that he was given in school was mostly to do with Britain, but yet he had knowledge of these maps that showed a vast world that just wasn't covered, and was kind of like it was a similar thing. Providing the motivation for me writing Motherland is that mine was sort of just traveling to Ghana, seeing what was going on, and when I came back to school here, doing tutor stuff, which was fine. I absolutely loved it. Maybe a little bit of Russian Revolution, but I think there are so many parts of the world that weren't covered. We didn't know Indian history, we didn't know African history, we didn't know South American history. We did a little bit of American. You do like, for example, civil rights movements, which is a lot later. None of the things you can learn. So I think as the world is, as there is becoming a balance between the different nations, the different world powers, I think it is a big benefit to be learning about the histories and cultures of these different places, and then also recognizing that some of these. These relationships and some of these interactions aren't necessarily new. I remember there was a big hullabaloo made about Chinese investment, for example, in Africa, and it been seen as a new thing. It's like, well, Africa had this deep relationship with Europe initially, actually, maybe in the 15th, 16th centuries, predicated more so on trade and was somewhat bilateral, and then later with the transatlantic slave trade in the colonial period, and that was almost the origins of Africa's international relationships. And then later on, you had China, when actually it was the other way around. The Indian Ocean trade in the beginning, from the 1st century AD, at the very latest, probably. Was this trade between Africa, particularly all the countries now on the East African coast, which then were mostly city-states. So, for example, in Tanzania and in Kenya, you had city-states and even in Somalia, you had Mogadishu was an important, an international trading city that was trading with Yemen, Oman, India, China, and then actually you had African diplomats from city-states like Malindi in Kenya who were traveling to China 80 years before the Portuguese reached East Africa. So that's an older relationship. That Sino-African relationship is an older relationship than even the European relationship with Africa, but yet this was being seen as a new thing, and that's because the deep history wasn't known, and then also even the form, the character that potentially takes as well. So I think that even knowing about that history can even put modern developments into new light, and actually understanding that history is crucial for understanding the way in which the world is potentially moving as well.
Yeah, and that brings to mind Verena Krebs' book on diplomatic relations between sort of medieval Ethiopia and medieval Europe, and also linking it back to ancient sort of authors, Greek and Roman, who talk about these trade links. And this is something that somehow gets a bit missed when you're talking about, you know, the history of different countries within the kind of the history curriculum at schools, but even at a university level, you know, it becomes sort of displaced and does not take center stage. And actually there has been all of these relationships, whether that's good or bad, and we're not talking about just positive trade links here, we're talking the negative side of that, and we're talking about the influences, so, you know, sort of spices being imported and exported, and people being imported and exported, and, you know, people like the ancient East Africans sort of resettling in the Middle East or resettling in China or in Afghanistan, etc. But you don't hear about these stories. What you hear is about, if it's anything about Africa, it's like, oh, the transatlantic slavery. And this is just such a corrosive, and it becomes quite traumatic in terms of the generational sort of history of our people as Africans or African descendants, where you think, hang on, why is this continuing? And then you look at the sort of how Black people are portrayed in TV, etc., and it's still that kind of negative sort of stereotypes and this kind of superior, inferior civilizations, which, you know, I think it's really it's imperative to break that down and actually just compact it and disprove it and demystify it too, right?
Yeah, and that was, you know, that's one of the reasons why actually the subtitle of the book is it's mentioned, and one of the words I mentioned is identity, because that was one of the key things for me, was actually addressing this idea of what it means to be African, what people understand, or how people understand what it means to be African in particular. And I think that aspect of inferiority, of victimization, I think plays a big part in that identity. But it's like, you know, for example, in a way, it's like Christianity, example, is not really something that is seen as historically an African religion, and yet one of the oldest Christian states in the world is Ethiopia, for example. So Ethiopia was Christian long before any nation in Western Europe was, and yet Christianity is seen more so as a Western religion than it is in East. I mean, I know also Armenia is an incredibly old Christian faith, and actually that these religions originated, you know, in the Middle East, and yet when we think about Christianity, and especially, perhaps also sort of American influence, American culture, and it has something to bear on it, we think of it as being, as it were, a white Christian thing, when actually it's the opposite, and it's not something that I think figures into ideas of African identity. I think African societies being globally connected from the ancient world and beyond. Again, when we think about African identity, we don't think of it as being as ancient a thing as it actually is. I mean, we talked about, you know, ancient sources, the ancient world. I mean, when we think about the ancient world, we primarily think of Greece, Rome, and possibly Egypt. But another key civilization that had a huge influence on the ancient world, on Egypt, and on Greece, and on Rome, and vice versa, was Nubia. You know, the Sudanese culture that existed from 5000 BC and still exists, but from 800 BC to 350 AD, the Nubians were there interacting with Egyptians, with Greeks, with Romans, and in fact, they are the ones who probably innovated the warfare use of elephants that was used by the Persians and that was used by the Romans as well. And that's a Nubian practice. And the Greeks were also drawing Nubian soldiers. They were often used as mercenaries because they were seen as being martially very experienced and very skilled. So they're used as mercenaries in Greek and Persian armies, but then also they're seen as being very pious. And then you actually have some ancient historians, Greek and Roman historians, who talk about the influence and the impact that Nubian cultural practices and religious practices and linguistic practices have had on the Egyptians as well. So they're all interacting, and then also on trade too. A lot of the gold and ivory that ends up in Rome, for example, comes from Nubia. It comes via Nubia, I should say. It actually comes from deeper in the African interior, but it's passing through Nubia, which is a crucial node on this international trade network. But it's not something generally that's figured, or that people don't know that there are 10 times as many pyramids, if not more, in Nubia, in Sudan, than there are in Egypt. And again, it's just not known about. And this was something actually that it's partly it's partly cultural, the reason we don't know about this, but some of it was actually purposeful in academic fields. You had this American archaeologist, George A. Reisner, who basically, because that he sees that dark-skinned people are living in Nubia and light-skinned people are living in Egypt, that he decides to consider Nubia or Sudan a satellite state of the Egyptians, when in fact there was a much more equal relationship between them. And actually at one point, in around 800 BC, you had Nubian kings, the Nubian pharaohs, who they conquered Egypt and had a huge influence on the culture and on it today. But again, that's something that is just not figured, and it doesn't fit into, I think, our ideas of generally African identity. And I know that even with this book, talking about 500,000 years of African culture identity, I am talking generally. I recognize and understand there's a huge amount of diversity on the continent. I mean, Africa is as a continent, probably the most diverse continent in the world. A third of languages spoken in the world are spoken just in Africa alone. Or not alone, but they're spoken in Africa. But there are these huge differences. But there are also things, I think, that there are similarities between cultures as well, and those are actually the touch points that I pick up on the book. So yes, I am exploring in the book. I explore these 500,000 years, but the way in which I do it is to split them up into these 10 thematic chapters, each of which covers a theme that I think is an important aspect of African identity. So for example, although there are differences in the way in which we carry out these practices, let's say ancestral veneration is an important one, remembering and respecting and recognizing those who have come before us and the roles that they've played in our lives and that importance. That's something that I would say even most people do. It's even something that I think is cross-cultural, not just within Africa but actually internationally. But it's something that almost every African culture does in some way, shape, or form. So that's where the difference is in how we remember, how we respect our ancestors. So, for example, in some cultures it's about giving offerings of food or alcohol. In others, it's about holding festivals, or in others, it's about building shrines. And there's a difference, but it's all to do with that. Oral literature is another aspect that I covered, how we remember and recount the past through stories. And I'm in Ghana, where I'm from, we have this, one of the main ethnic groups there, the Akan, and a subset of that ethnic group is called the Ashanti. And we have these figures called the Ochiami, who are like the keepers of the stories. But then they have an equivalent all across the Sahel, or the Sudan more specifically, so the western part of the Sahel, in Senegal and in Guinea and in Mali, called the griots, who are again the same keepers of the stories. So again, all figuring into that idea of what it means to be African, the importance of ancestors, the importance of community, the importance of oral literature, the being globally connected, trade, religion, the origin and spread of world religions in important centres in Africa. I mean, I hear stories of the Ark of the Covenant being in Ethiopia, which I've yet, and the origin of the Queen of Sheba, who obviously marries King Solomon, and so there's all that rich. You might be like.
Well, I did visit the Axum.
Have you seen the warrior monk who keeps apparently the Ark of the Covenant safe?
Yeah, it was when I visited Ethiopia in 2019, and we flew into Axum for for maybe a few days, and there was Mary of Zion Church where supposedly this covenant is supposed to be. And of course, we weren't allowed to see it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
no one can ever know.
Yeah, it'll be a scene out of Indiana Jones, right? Exactly. But that's really interesting because what I was going to sort of relate that to is the way that you write, firstly, reminds me of Herodotus, the 5th century Greek historian.
That is big praise there. We're gone. He's the OG, to be fair. So he is the father of history.
And also he grew up in Persian-occupied Greek territory, so he wasn't from Greece mainland. And the way that he writes is, I mean, if you're like at the forefront of writing a new kind of work, where do you start? And he uses a lot of myths and turns them on their heads. And what he does is quite a thematic approach. So he starts off by saying, I'm going to tell you the real reason behind the war between the Persians and the Greeks. And then that starts off a whole kind of history lesson. But every book is dedicated to a particular culture that the Persian and Greek have encountered. And so it doesn't take this kind of linear approach. It kind of takes a cultural thematic approach where you're looking at the cultural sort of aspects of the people, rather than just taking it as, sort of a chronological, sort of linear narrative. And that's what I find very interesting about your book, and perhaps it is because of your anthropological background.
I would say probably my anthropological background.
Where you are taking, and what he was interested in was he was thinking, right, I hear about this in the myths, etc., and the oral telling, but I'm going to go and see it, and I'm going to interview people. I'm going to be there right on the ground and finding out about whether these stories actually happen. But he would also make up some of his own, and then that gets into this popular history.
Until you said that, I was going to say, it sounds like he's copied me. I don't know.
Right. But what's interesting is this conversation between past and present, and the kind of the middle space of fact and fiction. And I'm afraid, Ethiopians and Eritreans are very good at that, where it gets all a little bit murky, where we cannot, sort of untangle the myth from the history. And so anyone who tries to find out about Ethiopian Eritrean history is like, what's going on? What's going on? But that actually is really important because, it's very similar in the way that the Assyrians and the Persians also tell their stories. So this idea of telling history, and the word history is historia, which means the Greek for to inquire. So it's a mishmash of fact and fiction. But they are so important to people because people, the way they tell who they are, their identity and heritage, isn't just fact, is it? It is just a mixture of that. Yeah. And the way that you kind of anchor these kind of thematic chapters is by talking about present people. So what was really interesting about the race conversation was it starts with Kamala Harris and her kind of dual multi-heritage, and when you're talking about ancestral
like veneration.
Veneration, you talk about Chadwick Boseman.
Yes, yeah.
And so these things are so relatable, and you think, well, actually, why are we talking in this kind of linear conversations and not circular? You know,
Yeah.
that the past obviously affects our present, but the present also affects the past.
Yes, yeah, no, something. So, you know, what Ms. alludes to is in the book for a lot of chapters, and sometimes I start a chapter with a contemporary stories, but throughout the book, there are woven into, you know, I weave in and out of sort of past, the deeper past, ancient and medieval past, the things that we traditionally consider history, but then I also tell stories that are a little bit closer in our time. So like May says, I do a chapter on ancestral veneration, and for that one, I tell it, you know, I start talking about I talk about generally how Africans relate to, how they relate to death, how they relate to people who've passed on, and we generally have this idea that when someone dies, as it were, they don't cease to exist. Generally, they basically move from the mortal world into the spirit world, but it's still possible to maintain that relationship with them and connect with them. And we call those people generally known as the living dead, especially in academic or scholarly circles. And amongst the living dead, those people who achieved a lot in life before they passed on, we consider those the ancestors. So those are the ones, almost like our role models, spiritual role models. You know, I talk about the importance of the ancestors, how we connect with them as role models. And what I say is that what I found interesting is that when Chadwick Boseman died in, I think, 2013, 2014, whatever it was, there were a lot of people, when they were paying tribute to him, a lot of Africans who were talking about him as an ancestor. They said, you know, he's joined the ancestors, he's an ancestor now. There was that same kind of relationship with a figure who had died in the modern world. And this is something I generally try and make clear in the book, is that, you know, there isn't that clear distinction, especially in practices, between in African practices between past and present. They sort of continue on. There's a continuum of these practices, and a lot of the practices, a lot of the beliefs that meant something to Africans in the past, or how they were practiced in the past, they still mean the same thing, almost the same thing, if not exactly the same thing as they did today. So. And also in different contexts as well, because a lot of the people who are doing it for Chadwick Boseman were American. A lot of them were African-American who were saying, you know, he's become an ancestor. So even then, in that context, with all the disruption and dislocation, there's this still profound understanding of ancestorship. And one of the reasons for that is that Chadwick Boseman was someone that a lot of people looked up to. He wanted to play characters that were, you know, that basically showed African Americans in a positive light. He played Thurgood Marshall, and you know, before he did Black Panther, he played Thurgood Marshall, and he played Jackie Robinson, and he played James Brown. All these people who were considered ancestors. So he was almost like an ancestor avatar in a way. Was Chadwick Boseman, and that's how people considered him. And he would be given roles where they'd say, we want you to play an enslaved African, or we want you to play a stereotypical African of someone who, you know, someone whose mum's on heroin and their dad left when they're young, etc. And he said, I don't want to do that. I want to play these positive characters, and that culminated in Black Panther. So a lot of people looked up to that, such that when he died, he was seen as this role model. He was seen as this ancestor. But I think you picked up on something really interesting, was this conflation, especially when we talk about history, of myth and history. And I think, I'll be honest, I think there's nowadays, especially in academia, people really try and distinguish between the two. In anthropology, you're actually kind of taught to see them as almost one and the same thing generally. But I would argue that there is no such thing as pure history.
A different thing then.
Yeah, different. Yeah. But then I think there's this argument that there is. I think some people consider it, or we think of history as being something that is purely rooted in fact. It's just absolutely. I don't think it's the case. But I think where it's interesting, the African context, is that Africans are just a lot more honest about that generally, because I think even the way in which we remember, for example. Even the recent history of, let's say, the United Kingdom, we talk about people, and I think that's where the whole field of revisionist history even comes about. It's like when you imagine, even when I was young, and even I'll speak to my father, when he was young and he was interested in history, English history and military history, and I used to imagine, let's say, the Battle of Britain, etc., and he used to see it as purely English fighter pilots who were doing X, Y, and Z, and maybe imagine Michael Caine or whatever doing something Battle of Britain, and then you look at the real history and it's like, oh wait, there are a lot of Polish pilots, for example, as well, who formed an important part of winning that conflict. But they are They are written. So there is actually a myth about how some of these things took place. But, and the real history, as it were, these are the factors that don't come into play. They aren't considered. So then it's like, but then sometimes the mythological aspect, the thing that is remembered, is taken by people to be the real factual history when it is in fact a myth. And actually, you'd have to dig deeper to look into it. And I think in the African context, what's interesting is that I think we generally, again, I'm just always generalizations, we consider history for the most part in a different way. It's less about trying to understand the precise facts of the past and trying to understand more your origins as a people, the things that are important to you, what it means to be who you are. And that's where mythology, I think, can be a lot more powerful, but why mythology figures into a lot of history. So, for example, like I said, being from Ghana, being Ashanti, we have, the origin of the Ashanti is that perfect blend of history and mythology. We know that historically, in the early 18th century, there was a king called Osei Tutu who basically defeated this other. He sort of forms this coalition with allies who are again part of the wider ethnic group called the Akan. So it's all these different Akan clans, and he basically forms a coalition between them to defeat the most powerful Akan clan, which are called the Denchira, and that is, as it were, historically recorded, that he forms this coalition, he defeats them in battle, he takes over their territories, and he forms what becomes known as the Ashanti Empire, the origin. Now, there's also a mythological element. He has this right-hand man, this priest called Anoche, and the story goes that after Osei Tutu had defeated the Denchira, basically Akomfo Anoche, or Priest Anoche, he summons from the sky this golden stool, which lands in Osei Tutu's lap, and all the chiefs who had formed the coalition with him basically swear allegiance to Osei Tutu on the stool. So that's the way the story goes. Now, historically, yeah, but what's interesting is that story governs still the relationship between the Akan peoples today. And the golden stool as an artifact does exist. It probably wasn't summoned from the sky, but it was smelted and it was created, and it does exist as this as an artifact that binds the different Akan people together and to the Ashanti nation. So it plays that role, and that myth aspect is just basically to say that it is a divine covenant. That is the importance of the myth. That it's something that if you break, it's not something that's only affecting people in the mortal world. It's not just an earthly thing. It's a heavenly thing as well. So it's an important thing. Mm-hmm. It's more important even than you might originally consider to break or to contravene this important covenant, because it has a heavenly aspect to it. It's not just the store that was made by a goldsmith somewhere. It was something that was summoned from the heavens, and that's what governs the relationship. So it has this extra significance as well, and it's something that has really helped to maintain I think on the one hand, to be fair, the dominance of the Ashanti, which is part of it. It's partly about legitimacy, royal legitimacy. It's for the same reason that the pharaohs or the kings of Nubia were considered sort of culturally Horus. They were considered, as it were, Horus's earthly counterpart, and their mothers were considered Isis as well. So it's about their connection to the gods enhances their legitimacy, which means that it's harder to question them. It's also something that so it enhances the legitimacy of the Akan King, the golden stool, but it's also something that maintains harmony amongst the different peoples and amongst the different clans as well. So I think that's where mythology can figures into it, and I think generally that's where it's really important. In every context, but I think in the African context in particular, for really helping people to understand the importance and significance of things that happened in the past that have made them who they are today, and which things are of particular and rare significance, and which things don't need to be considered in such a light and in such a way.
I was just thinking about to come back to the Chadwick reference, and when we went to see Black Panther, and obviously it was the highest grossing film, and for a superhero film that was so important, and it had sort of black cast, and it was just genuinely just brilliant. in recentering African stories. But one of the, I suppose, slightly negative side of that, I always thought, was that in the representation of Black Panther, and Chadwick does go to, I can't remember where he went, was it Ghana?
Yes, he went to Ghana, yes,
and
to
he
research,
spoke Yoruba in some of the lines in the film.
Yes, he spoke Yoruba.
There were, I suppose, a kind of romanticized version of Africa, and there were certain cultures that were perhaps predominantly shown above other cultures. And in this book, what you sort of, the absolute importance of that book is saying, oh my gosh, Africa is a massive continent. It's not a bloody country, sorry. Oh, is that allowed? It is now. You know, there are, you know, at least 54 different countries. The linguistic diversity, not just the ethnic diversity, but the linguistic diversity is extraordinary. And I hate the term sub-Sahara because I think that's a colonial term and we are moving away from using that to differentiate between the kind of Maghreb, you know, northern African countries and the southern because of the...
sort of sophisticated Africa, exactly, dark continent.
Exactly. And I think it's really important that we move away from that. But you do use the analogy of the marbles to kind of talk about the sort of the ancient diversity. And then to come back round to the modern diversity of African nations and to just not assume that we're, you know, say you have your own kind of Ghanaian traditions, the Ashanti, and then you're thinking, hang on a second, this is just an extraordinary world of different cultures and different ethnicities that people may not get.
Yeah, no, and I think with Black Panther, again, I think, you know, Chris is valid. The difficult thing with that is that obviously a lot of the people, I mean, when Chadwick Boseman, before when he found out he got the role, he did a DNA test and he found out where he was from. So he's like, I'm part of the Limba ethnic group from Sierra Leone. I'm Yoruba, who's this ethnic group from Nigeria, and I think Jola as well. But he and the different people on the cast who I think had done something similar, or at least knew their different backgrounds. And when they were doing research, again, they went to these different parts of Africa. And they basically, the thing is for the film, they basically drew on what they liked. They weren't really, you know, even for the Black Panther character himself, T'Challa, I mean, Boseman drew on a range of references, actually both indigenously African and in the African diaspora. You know, he drew on Fela Kuti, who's like the father of modern Afrobeat. So he drew on that, and he drew on Patrice Lumumba, you know, DLC, and he drew on, you know, and on sort of Angolan capoeira, like dance fighting, but also Yoruba priests, etc., and brought that all into it. So I think with Black Panther, you just get, so it is a fantasy. You get this mishmash fantasy, and I think another fantasy, which is the idea that ancient Africa, medieval Africa, was a complete utopia, which again, of course, it isn't, and that's something that I do try to pay attention to in the book. I do think that there are a lot of, you know, a lot of great civilizations doing great things, Mali and Zimbabwe, etc. But then also there's, as is the you know, figures in the history of the other place. You also have these difficulties and, you know, and these brutalities, and you know, you have warfare, and you do have you have warfare, and you have conflict, and you have all you know, all these kinds of things as well. But you know. So that diversity to recognise is important. That there's the general things that I think a lot of Africans practice, but there is that huge diversity. And you said, like you mentioned, the marble analogy. I mean, there's one chapter basically where I talk about, you know, the name of the chapter is, which is where the marble example figures, is called "We Are More Than Skin Color." And it was just the way, it was just trying to challenge this idea of people generally referring to every African person, no matter their background, their heritage, simply by their skin color or perceived skin color, which more often than not is black, which I think is an identity in its own right in certain context, but in Africa itself doesn't really figure so much, because it's not, you know, it's not the other, it's not in contradistinction to anything, because everybody there is kind of dark-skinned. But as well as the ethnic linguistic diversity. And there's actually huge racial diversity in the African continent, which again, a lot of people aren't aware of. And the reason for that goes back to the fact that Africa is the origin of humanity. So now archaeologists and ethnoanthropologists and ethnoarchaeologists essentially believe that instead of human beings developing from, we sort of have this linear idea of evolution. I'm sure we've all seen that diagram of the monkey who sort of turns into the man with a laptop. That's kind of how we think, I think even generally to a certain extent, but now archaeologists believe that basically there were across the continent at different times, all moving and interacting with each other as well at different times. There were basically different distinct human groups. So 7 million years ago is when our evolutionary line diverged from that of chimpanzees. So our first reckoned ancestor is Sahelanthropus chadensis, Sahel man of Chad, and that's where the artifacts of him, and he's considered the first hominid, i.e. Being or primate who looks more like a human being, like a non-human being, than it does a chimpanzee, basically. So 7 million years ago, and then maybe different groups of Sahelanthropus chadensis moved to different parts of Africa where, because of different selection pressures, because Africa, again, is in its environment is incredibly diverse. So they would move to different environments. We had a diversity of environments. One might be in a really lush area, one in a savanna area, etc. And living there for hundreds of thousands or millions of years, they developed differently into different kinds of beings. So this was happening all across the continent. And then at some point, because of certain environmental pressures, maybe they had to move and such a food or water, whatever, would migrate, and then they would they would encounter these other groups across the continent and mix with each other, and from that mixing a new group would be made. And this was just happening over millions and millions of years. So you just have this exponential proliferation of just groups that is happening all across the continent, and that's where that diversity comes from. Then you had certain peoples that weren't, or certain hominids who moved out of Africa, at certain points. So it's like the Neanderthals, was it 100 to 200,000 years ago, whatever it is, and then were exposed to the selection pressures in those different environments, let's say, of what we know now as Europe. And then some of them, who moved to different areas would come back to Africa and mix with the groups there. So that's how you have that proliferation of the different peoples in Africa, all for them sort of related, but all actually distinct in their own way. So that's how diversity was happening. And then when out of all that mixing, basically at a certain point, well, not a certain, but about 150,000 years ago, out of that mixing originated who we are, Homo sapiens. So we are basically all the traits that we have, and this is, when I say Homo sapiens, this is kind of how we're identified by our traits. So what defines a Homo sapien is, for example, having a large standing upright, standing erect, having a large brain case or a brain that's a certain size, whatever it is, and that's how archaeologists sort of define Homo sapiens. So out of all this mixing, they came a group of people with the traits that define us, Homo sapiens, and then around 100,000 years ago, some of or 100 to 200,000 years ago, some of those Homo sapiens, a group of those Homo sapiens basically migrated to the Middle East, and then one group migrates, sort of from that group, a subset of that group migrated, to Oceania, etc., and then a subset from that group migrated here. But the original group was in Ethiopia. But then what happens is that when a subset of a group migrates to somewhere else, in this case from Ethiopia to the Middle East, they only take with them a small amount of the genetic variation from the original group. So I liken it to having a bag of marbles where you have, let's say, 2 yellow, 2 blue, 2 green, and then which is the original bag, and then when a group of those marbles, as it were, migrates, let's say you end up with, 1 blue, 1 green, but no yellow. So then immediately that second group is less diverse, less genetically diverse, culturally diverse, etc., than that original group. And that was what was happening as Homo sapiens moved across the world. And the peoples, those less genetically diverse peoples who moved across the world, they're the ancestors of modern day Indians, Chinese, Europeans, etc. Whereas that original group actually is still in Africa. So that's where you can do genetic testing. A lot of genetic testing to understand where you're from. You basically have to take the genes of these very, very old groups in Africa, like the Khoisan hunter-gatherers, for example, in southern and eastern Africa, who have some of the oldest genes, some of the, because they're basically they're almost the original descendants of that group that lived 150,000 years ago in Africa. So that was how, I hope it made sense the way I explained it now, but that was how I tried to just get across this idea of exponential African diversity, and then another thing that was happening is that later on, as well as having, you had certain groups who sort of, we had a group that sort of came together. It was known as a particular group, but sometimes they would migrate as well, and they would interact with different groups again as they moved across the continent. And this is just something that was just continuously happening for hundreds of thousands of millions of years. And scholars call this they refer to this as deep population substructures, like the technical term, which basically means that because the peoples of Africa are so old, you've just had so much mixing and so much movement and so much mixing and so much evolution, essentially, over millions of years, which has given rise to just so many different groups of people that inherit the continent. And again, so things like that's why you'll have people even across the continent. You have people of different racial, i.e., specifically genetic backgrounds, which also, and then this is also partly genetic, but then also partly environmental, is that they will also have, different skin colors as well. So, like someone in Kenya, for example, does not look the same at all to like a Nigerian, because they're genetic, but then also their genetic history is different, but then also their developmental history based on the environment it was really different, and you can actually see that in the skin color as well. The Kenyan might be a lighter brown color, or it's even like the Khoisan. Those really old people in southern and eastern Africa, they don't have dark skin. That's the interesting thing. They have more yellow skin. Actually, you see some of them, and some of them look actually a little bit more Chinese. Actually, weirdly, you're just like, what? So, but they are and consider themselves African through and through. Again, and this is even just goes back to the book more generally, just trying to. And the subtitle, when talking about African identity, just trying to explode these ideas of African identity and what it means to be African. So it's like, oh wow, not just the ancestral veneration, but also even that deep history of the migration movement, mixing and evolution. That's also something that defines, yes, what it means to be human, but then also particularly what it means to be African.
Absolutely, and it kind of feeds into our modern conversations around migration and the kind of hostility and toxic narratives around that, and to counter that narrative. I could talk to you all day, obviously, but I won't, because I'll give a chance for some people to ask you questions. Somebody please ask him about the female warrior queen who drinks the
Queen Mothers and Warrior Queens.
Yeah, yes, and who drinks blood as well. That's a really
not just
intriguing...
for fun, she doesn't do it.
It's a kind of ceremonial
not just as an
thing.
evening tipple, like it's part of a...
Get my groove on.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me, but I'm going to hand this over to you beautiful people with any potential questions that you might want to ask Luke. Oh, right at the top there. You're not planted at all, Josh. I mean,
Thank you. Thank you for that great talk, Luke. I was curious, in a book that is covering so much, and knowing what I know about what you can put in and what you have to leave out, was there anything that you were forced to leave out of the book that you'd like to share now, that you think that you really would have loved to keep in?
Yes, I think one thing that I generally that I kind of wanted to touch upon, but then as I was writing the book, but I didn't get as much of an opportunity to, except for one chapter where I'm talking about Swahili trade and global Swahili trade relationships, with China and India and so forth, was actually just, and I do a little bit on Mali, as at the beginning I talk about Mansa Musa and his development of medieval Mali and the University of Timbuktu, one of the earliest of the world in the early 14th century. It was that I didn't really get to tackle as much civilizational history, as it were, just African societies as independent civilizations who, independently of other places, did great, for the most part, did great things. So, for example, one thing that I wanted to look at, but I had to leave out, was the 14th century art of the Yoruba, this Nigerian group, and they cast these incredible brass, I mean, they're called bronze, but brass heads, which figure amongst the most ingenious, beautiful, sophisticated works of art. In fact, so much so that the German anthropologist Leo Frobenius, who was one of the earliest outside of Africa to kind of see these, thought that they were made by the ancient Atlanteans, which was didn't want to give Nigerians the credit at all, or the Yoruba the credit, but they are absolutely exquisite. There were tens of these cast, and they were the heads of Yoruba monarchs, kings and queens. So that, and then also another example is Great Zimbabwe, this kingdom that existed in Zimbabwe from the 11th to 15th century, which just has so much mystery attached to it. So there are these, for example, they were important actually in that Indian Ocean trade as well. A lot of the gold that the Swahili sent to even up to the Mediterranean, Western Europe, and then also to India and China, and that came from nearby Great Zimbabwe. So it was the Great Zimbabweans who were sourcing that gold and then trading it to them. But they built these. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They built these concentric stone circles, or this wonderful edifice, this wonderful stone city, which are these huge concentric stone circles, and some of them are 9-10 feet high, where they move these massive blocks, but they built them, without mortar. So their understanding of engineering, of architecture, of craft was phenomenal, and I wish I could have dug a little bit into that, like just done a chapter on just incredible sort of African inventions, artistic inventions, and that would have been, and that would have been something that I probably would have put in the same place as Mali or the University of Timbuktu. Another kind of accomplishment. I would have liked to do a chapter on accomplishments and dig into those deeper, but maybe next time.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Is there anyone online, just to give them an opportunity?
Yeah. We have one question from Liz. Liz first states that in North America, there are still a fair number of white archaeologists whose bias greatly influences how they interpret their excavations at Native American archaeological sites. Do you still see similar happening in Africa today?
I think not so much within the continent, because actually a lot of indigenous or a lot of African archaeologists, anthropologists, historians are doing really great work. We talk about Zen Abadawi's book, and actually there was this project done sort of in the post-colonial era with UNESCO, which was this series of history books written by African scholars, basically. But it's a very traditional history. I would say. I think they mention things like mythology, etc., and they use that evidence, and they use oral history, so they use all the evidence, but they discuss it in a little bit of a skeptical way. I think they want it to be seen seriously by the international history community, so there's not as much of an emotional attachment to the history, but it's still a great resource of stuff. So I think actually on the content we're lucky. I think that period, the thing is when archaeology and anthropology particularly were nascent in their really early stages, because they are disciplines that are, for better or worse, they're intimately connected with colonialism, basically, and something you learn really early on, and that's because in the way in which archaeology and anthropologists, especially anthropologists, studied, it was always they saw other peoples almost as it were as specimens, and they would discuss them objectively, not really as human beings in a sense. And that's not to say that they didn't view them emotionally as human beings, but intellectually they would discuss them in a way that was sort of very othering, almost like they were in a beaker of some kind. So it's concerned with that, but I think because Africa figured quite a lot in that early history, a lot of that history or that biased history or biased anthropology done by those kinds of scholars was done in the early period, and actually but it's sort of come to an end, sort of played out, and now you have people on the continent who are looking at history in their own way as well, and so it was even up until the 1960s or 1970s in Rhodesia that you could be, as an academic, you could lose your job, you could even be imprisoned for basically saying that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans. Genuinely. So there's one great, and he was white to be fair, but there's one great Zimbabwean archaeologist called Peter Garlick, who actually fled the country. He left the country because he was trying to say that, and I think these are built by the indigenous Shona people and the Rhodesian government, basically like what you're saying is illegal. So he actually had to flee. So it was, I mean, it's sort of, you sort of have 100 years of that happening in Africa already. So I think it's sort of reached the tail end, so it's kind of played out, and now you see a rise of indigenous people. But I think the biggest thing will be for Africans to kind of take their history more seriously intellectually. I think we have a very good emotional relationship with our history, but I think still, a lot of places in Africa, it's not really that really prestigious thing, to be honest, to be a historian. You know, it's kind of lawyer, doctor, engineer. Like, academic is like that, but you have to be doing something. You know, it's in terms of the humanities. I think the humanities more generally aren't as respected, aren't as respected as they should be on the continent. I think that's where a lot of but another thing has also just been certain concerns. You know, I think a lot of African leadership has been concerned with politics and economics and the difficult politics and economics of their countries and of the community to be able to do history. But then as those are becoming more stabilized, I would say generally there are still, obviously very difficult areas, but as things are becoming stabilized, I think there will be a greater interest in history.
My family did not know that I was doing classics until I was graduating.
There you go.
They assumed I was doing a law degree, so for 3 years I had to pretend.
It's still the thing. I mean, I'm lucky. I think that my father, because he was American, was supportive of what I did. But amongst his brothers, one is literally an engineer, one's a doctor, one's a lawyer.
All my family are engineers.
So it was the thing that's seen as being
What kind of job are you going to go into?
That's the
I was just thinking. Oh, and Professor Shadrack's work in Oxford University. He's an archaeologist, an anthropologist. On Great Zimbabwe, I thoroughly recommend as well. So he's currently in Oxford. Do we have time for one more question? Is that okay?
Let's do a few more. It's fine.
You're so accommodating.
Who's got questions?
So. Oh yes, with the headscarf.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
I'm also Nigerian, and the look on my dad's face when I said I wanted to be a historian was just something.
Defiance,
I really enjoyed what you said about the impact of Christianity in Africa, but I'm from the north of Nigeria, so we're Muslim. So what could we say about the spread of Islam and how that has also affected
That's a great question.
Africa? And I think I forget to teach our kids, because I'm a teacher, about how Islam also went to North America because of the slaves as well, and that's a little part that also doesn't get taught as well. But
that's true. That is so.
Yes, and especially amongst like quite a few civil rights leaders as well who adopted Islam, and they saw this being reported. It was Malcolm X, I think.
Malcolm X.
I was incorrect. So this is the thing. I think Islam is another important world religion that's really, really old. In Africa, I mean Bali. I mean, so you have the reason I would say early on Islam comes to West Africa, and I mean maybe Nigeria a little bit later, North Nigeria a little bit later, especially but it comes to, for example, Mali itself, the countries that are now that were part of the Mali Empire, and let's say or the Mali Kingdom in the 8th, 9th centuries, which is when it arrived, sort of the 8th, 9th century. So it's very early on. It's only 100 years or so after its founding, and the reason it comes largely to those places, including Nigeria, especially with the kingdoms there, including, I would say, particularly in Nigeria, the Ghanaian-born Empire, is because of trade. So with the rise of Islam, especially in the Middle East, they become the big traders. The nations or the states of Western Asia, what we know as the Arab world.
So it was a sort of merchants, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was states of merchants, exactly. So basically belonging to, and it was international, because you also have, slightly later on from, the 8th, 9th, and then up until the 15th century, you also have the Muslims who conquer Spain, as well, southern Spain, Andalusia. They're in the Mediterranean, they're in North Africa, they're in Western Asia. Then there's also Islam also comes to Eastern Africa as well, and then it's also in Western Africa too, and it's basically adopting Islam as a monarch or as a merchant was really important for your trade relationships. And there was this, and this is the thing, I think when we think of the historical world, we consider it as being, almost like a world of separate nations, but actually religion played an important part in in the world you belong to. So Mali, etc., and Mali and all these other places, Spain, they were all seen as part of one world, which was the Muslim world, because they were all Muslim. And I know that the kings of Mali in particular were very pious. But I think another important thing to recognize, and especially in African context, is that especially historically, this might change now, but historically, the adoption of any kind of world religion would be syncretic. So, for example, the kings, for the most part, the elite of Mali, the merchants, the kings, the diplomats, would be the most pious Muslims and practice it quite piously. But on the whole, the general population they weren't forcibly converted. They weren't forced to become Muslim, and they, for the most part, maintained their traditional indigenous, possibly animist religions as well, or belief systems. And the kings themselves, even though they practiced Islam, they would also practice. They would also take part in and practice rituals that were traditional. That were traditional too. And it's interesting always seeing the difference actually between sometimes a Muslim who would come from a different part of the world. Someone say, for example, you have the great traveller and historian Ibn Battuta, who comes from Morocco, and he goes to Mali, and he's basically aghast at how sort of lightly dressed their women are, for instance, because he's used to a different kind of, his Sunni Islam is very different. And that's another thing to consider, is that, especially, for example, in East Africa, but I think West Africa, depending on the sect of Islam, because obviously it's a different sect that was powerful or influential, you would often have different people adopting different sects, and that was all to do with improving mostly their trade, political and diplomatic relationships, but then also did have this pious thing. It wasn't completely mercurial as well, but yes, another old religion, really old religion in Africa, and that shaped a lot of it. But it's interesting you say from North Nigeria, because the same in Ghana. It's like the northern Ghanaians are Muslim, but it's for some reason it didn't, and I think it didn't really penetrate. Right. So Christianity comes to Ghana, 1,000 years later than Islam, via the Atlantic, to the coast with the Europeans. But up until then, it was mostly the traditional religions, and it doesn't really penetrate past the forest areas. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but yes. Sorry. Yeah.
Fun fact, which I learned through Zainab Bandawi's book, is that the exiled followers of Prophet Muhammad took refuge in Ethiopia. They arrived via Eritrea, and in the Dalek Islands, there's the first mosque in the world.
Wow, that's good.
On that note...
Let's do one more.
Yeah.
Let's do one more. Let's do one more.
He's looking at me going, oh,
all right, okay.
But you could absolutely approach Luke at the break, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You're here.
If you have any burning questions, I'm around.
You are
yes.
here.
Yes.
But I just wanted to thank you for such a really interesting, invigorating conversation. So, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much.